Hello and welcome to the Heptio Ark office hours. Today is February 27th and it is 2018. We are going to be talking about Heptio Ark and answering some questions and understanding what it is, why it is, and how to use it and poking around at it. So to get started, I think it would be meaningful if we all went down the line and said like your name, maybe what your interest is in Ark, if you've used it or not, and anything else you want to share. I will get started. I'm Kris Nova. I work at Heptio. My interest is learning more about the server component of Ark. When I first looked at it, it was a long time ago, and I started to vendor it into Kubernetes. So learning like how the deployment works now and the different components is interesting to me. Andy, if you want to go next.
Sure. I'm Andy Goldstein. I'm a staff engineer at Heptio and the lead for Ark. So that probably says enough for now. Happy to have everybody here.
Awesome. I'm going to go across the top of my screen here. So no particular order, just however Zoom has you guys. But it looks like next up is Travis.
Hi, I'm Travis Matera. I am an infrastructure engineer at Titanium Blockchain Infrastructure Services. You may have seen them on the news recently for not such good reasons, but we're recovering. And I do not know much about Ark at all, so I'm just here to find out what it is and what it can do for me.
Awesome. Thanks for joining. Next up, we have Nolan, who has their microphone. Oh, there you go.
I'm Nolan Brubaker. I've been at Heptio for 6 months now, gone on 6 months, working on the Ark team as a systems engineer.
Awesome. Next up, Josh, good to see you again.
Hey, Chris. Hey, everybody. I'm Josh, huge fan of Ark and what it is proposing to accomplish for us. So I have it running for clients in GKE and in AWS, and very happy to start to contribute on some of the documentation for issues that I've run into.
Awesome. Steve, Chris.
Hey everybody, I'm Steve Chris. I'm an engineer at Heptio. I've been working with Andy and Nolan on Ark since we launched the project, and I'm mostly excited to kind of meet some of the folks who are using it and hear a little bit about how that experience is going. Awesome.
Paul Bauer.
I got the pronunciation right. Awesome. Paul Bauer. I'm happy when people pronounce my name. I'm Paul Bauer, an engineer at Microsoft, and I'm working with the Ark team just to try and make Ark work awesomely on Azure.
Rad. Next up, Caleb.
Hi, my name is Caleb Timber. I work for General Dynamics. Just learning. I've been following Chris since you first started doing COPS, and I like all the stuff you work on.
Awesome. Well, thanks. Good to see you. There's a lot of people and the order's getting mixed up. If I forget anyone, I'm sorry, I'm not doing it on purpose, but it looks like Parthi is next.
Yeah. That's wrong. It's supposed to be a G or instance.
Okay. I'm not hearing anything. Did I skip over anyone?
Let's see.
I'm going to take that as a no. Okay, so we have some questions here on the left. I think the two ways we could do this is we could go through question by question. I'll ask the questions and we let the Ark team answer. Another way of doing this would be to do the unconference thing that we've done on some of the other community calls where we let people just like dump their ideas into the spreadsheet and then we vote on them afterwards. Does anybody have any strong opinions on how we want to self-organize this call?
Well, I think I'm going to take the port number out.
I'm happy to let people ask questions if they have specific ones that they want to get to. We put in a bunch of these questions just to kind of seed the conversation. So I think probably starting with what Ark is and why it exists would be good no matter what. And then beyond that, certainly open to however the group wants to do it.
Would it be meaningful to do like a hands-on keys demo at the end of the call and just show it in action? Okay.
Yeah, if you've got something ready.
I don't, but I do have the Ark team on the call, so you guys
Okay.
can walk me through.
Yeah, I can certainly show. I don't have a server up and running, but I can get one going while we're talking.
I can. I have 2 EC2 instances up, and it's running Kubernetes. I can share creds with you if that would be helpful.
That's cool. I'll just spin up a GKE cluster for right now while we're talking.
Okay, then let's go through these calls, do like open Q&A for the first half, and second half we'll watch Andy do some Ark hacking in his terminal. So yeah, first question, what is Ark?
All right, so Ark is a backup and recovery tool for Kubernetes. And it came about initially as we were trying to solve a problem of taking snapshots of EBS volumes that were associated with Kubernetes clusters. So dynamically provisioned persistent volumes from persistent volume claims, which turned into EBS volumes in AWS. And Ark initially was kind of built around that premise, but the initial prototype was fairly limited in that it only knew about certain types in the Kubernetes API. So it specifically knew how to back up things like pods and services and nodes and whatnot. But if people added additional APIs, whether that was to Kubernetes itself or through CRDs or aggregated API servers, we knew that Ark would have to be recompiled and adjusted every time that somebody added a new feature. So we kind of went back to the drawing board and decided to use the built-in discovery API. And that allows us to query for everything that the API server has and knows about. So we took this approach mainly because it allows us to get access to everything. It doesn't require access directly to etcd, which you won't have on GKE or some of the other managed Kubernetes offerings that are out there. And this is kind of the most portable way to do it and has hopefully the broadest amount of supported clusters out there in terms of what we can back up.
Okay. Does it back up like the cluster infrastructure, or does it just back up like what's running in your cluster?
It will not do anything that's infrastructure related. So if you have SSL certificates that are used for your CA or anything else related to running your API server, talking to etcd, etc., we don't know about that. We don't touch that because it requires or would require presumably SSH access into whatever servers you have running. That doesn't mean that we couldn't ultimately one day get there with maybe some hooks or some customization, but right now we only back up what we can get by talking to Kubernetes itself.
Does it back up any of the control plane or kubelet components, or just whatever is running on top of that stuff?
It will back up. So if you have, depending on how you've installed Kubernetes, let's say you have a kubeadm installation where you've got static manifests for the API server and the controller manager and the scheduler, we can't get at those because those are files on the servers. But we can back up everything if we can retrieve it as a pod or a secret or whatever the resource is.
Okay, so it backs up everything through the Kubernetes API?
Yeah.
Cool. The next question we have, unless anybody has any thoughts around that, what is our point?
When you back up secrets, are they encrypted in any way, or just curious?
So we don't currently encrypt secrets explicitly. So we do support, if you're using AWS, you can encrypt the entire backup tarball using the AWS SSE KMS. But with regards to the secrets themselves, we don't do any specific encryption there. It's something that a few folks have asked about, and so maybe something that we look to add in the future.
And one option would be to have a custom plugin that could operate on secrets and mutate the data to encrypt it prior to storing it in the backup.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna go to the next question. Can I run Ark on-prem, or do I have to use a cloud provider?
Go for it, Steve.
Yeah, sure. So we've designed Ark to be pluggable, and so there are kind of multiple ways that you could run it on-prem, not using a cloud provider. So the first part of that is that the place where we store the backups themselves is in an object storage system. And so if you're running on-prem and you don't have access, or you don't care to use S3 or Azure or Google's object store, you have the option to run your own on-prem object storage solution. We have done a lot of experimenting and work with Minio, which is an S3 compatible object storage system. So if you have a Minio installation locally, then you can run Ark in your on-prem cluster and back up into that Minio installation. Beyond that, if you are looking to take snapshots of persistent volumes in an on-prem setting, we don't have any snapshot providers implemented out of the box for that. But again, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. Ark is pluggable, and so you always have the option to write your own block store provider, which would allow you to implement snapshots for a block store solution that you have on-prem.
And we also have a prototype for Rook, which is a kind of a wrapper around Ceph for getting Kubernetes objects to talk to Ceph. That was done by one of our other engineers, Steve Sloka. It's very much a prototype, and there's some things that need to happen in Ceph itself to help make backups behave more like we currently, volume snapshots behave more like we currently expect. And then there was also interest from some community members to write some OpenStack Swift support. So I think they're off working on those plugins, but I'm not sure what the status is.
Okay. If I wanted to contribute a plugin or work on one or change something, can I contribute to Ark?
Most definitely. So we welcome any and all contributions, whether they're documentation, coding, assistance, answering questions. We definitely want your support and your contributions. For plugins specifically, we would encourage you to work on them in your own GitHub user accounts. And if you do something that's pretty cool and works, we will be happy to link to it from our README to get you the exposure and to make sure that anybody using Ark can get access to it. And that's one of the main reasons that we converted from not using plugins to using plugins, was so that we could have, or hopefully have, an ecosystem so that anybody around the world can customize it without having to have the Ark core team necessarily review it. We'd be happy to review your code, but we kind of feel like if it goes into the Ark repository, we end up having to maintain it and make sure that it continues to function. Whereas if you own it, you can rev it on your own timeline, and we'll work together with you as needed to make sure that everything's working the way you want it to.
Okay, so plugins are intentionally separated from the core of Ark then. What's the interface between the two? Like you said, plugin. Is it like a Go shared object plugin, or how does that work?
It is a separate executable, and we're using a library from HashiCorp called Go plugin. So we have kind of, I'll call it an SDK to some degree. It's an example repository for plugins. Let me grab a link and we'll stick that in the chat. And you can copy this repository and make minimal changes. And we've got a make file in there that's ready to go. So basically, if you work on a copy of this repository, you can put in whatever logic you want to create your own plugins. And we have a handy dandy Ark plugin add command that you basically give it the Docker image that contains your plugin, and that command will just modify the Ark deployment to include that plugin as simply as possible. And the communications interface is actually using gRPC and protobuf, but you generally don't have to know anything about that if you don't want to, because the SDK that we put together makes it so that you don't really have to implement much to take advantage of all of that.
Cool. Is there any like officially supported plugins? Like I know Terraform has like provisioners that they support for various clouds. Is there anything that Ark supports like that?
Yes, so we have internal plugins that are part of the Ark code base themselves for the cloud providers that we support out of the box, which are Amazon, Google, and Microsoft.
The big three. Awesome.
Yeah, the big three.
Yay. Okay, I just have a million questions anyway, but I'm gonna actually go through the questions we have.
Yeah, go for it. And I'm gonna get my cluster up and running. So Steve and Nolan, take over for a couple minutes here.
Sure. Okay. Any particular questions look exciting to you, Steve or Nolan, or I can just keep going down the list?
Yeah, why don't we just keep going?
Okay. Can I back up non-cloud volumes? I feel like we kind of already talked about that.
Yeah, so this is a great question. It's also, there's a slightly different answer to this. So this is a feature that we're working on going forward. So the idea is that rather than needing a block store provider that offers a snapshot API, we want to be able to back up arbitrary Linux file systems or directories, essentially. And so this is a feature that is in the process of being designed right now. I'm taking the lead on designing this, and we're hoping to have at least an alpha version of this feature out in the next release, which will be out around mid to late April. Mm-hmm. So the idea, what we're currently looking at is using a backup tool called Restic. It's an open source tool written in Go that does kind of arbitrary file system backups. And so we're looking to integrate this. So we would basically use a sidecar that contains the Restic binary, and we would use that to actually back up data in any volume. One of the major benefits of this, beyond just being able to back up volumes that don't have a snapshot API, is that the backup format is obviously agnostic to the cloud provider. And so this would allow you to migrate data from one cloud to another cloud. So you can take a full Ark backup using this technique in one of the public clouds, and then do a restore into another public cloud, including all the data.
So Restic will actually go and inspect the file system, understand what file system it is, and then just whatever data is there, it'll arbitrarily copy it to the same format every time.
So you basically point it to a directory within your running container. It'll capture all of that data, back it up to a backend running in presumably an object storage somewhere, and then be able to restore that. Yeah.
That's so rad.
Yeah. So it's a pretty exciting feature. We've been talking about it for a while, and we're finally getting to do some implementation here. So I'm really excited about this one.
Yeah, because this means we don't have a dependency on volume types anymore. You can just point it to any old directory, and we're going to back it up.
Right. Now there are definitely efficiencies to be had by using, snapshot APIs if they exist. If you know that you're just sticking within one cloud, they run very quickly. They process asynchronously in the background. It's easy to replicate the data across multiple regions or zones. But having the ability to do it in a different way gives you a lot of power and flexibility.
I had a question about that, Steve. Are there any roadblocks or obstacles in that path forward for that project? That sounds pretty cool.
Yeah, so we're definitely still in the process of design. So I think I'm working on some prototyping right now. I've already done some of it, and so I think the next steps will be to kind of publish a draft design document, and hopefully to get some feedback from the community on that. We definitely want to make sure that, as we're designing these things, we're covering the actual use cases that people have. So I would expect to see a document out, and, we'll push it out through the Google group and the Slack channel within the next week or two, and then collect feedback and then move on with implementation. So, no obvious roadblocks as of now, just need to move through the process.
Cool. Play testing.
Yeah.
I have a question about it. The volume you're talking about backing up directories, which if you mount a volume, it looks like a directory in the container.
Yep.
Are you looking to have it automatically when you say that to when you kick it off to automatically back up all the volumes that are specified in the pod, or do you have to specify each one that you would want individually?
Yeah, so that's one of the aspects that we're designing. So we certainly want to give the Ark user control over which volumes or which directories get backed up. So, one possible approach we're thinking about is that you place a set of annotations on the pods that you want to have volumes backed up that specify, the names of the volumes or the directory path that you want to back up. We may also give you some additional knobs within the backup spec itself. So if you've used Ark already, you know that we have this notion of kind of included and excluded namespaces and resources, as well as label selectors. So we may give you something similar to control which volumes get backed up.
All right.
Awesome. Next question. Can I execute commands pre and post backup?
I can grab this one. So I believe Ark 6 added support for running arbitrary commands pre-backup. Ark 0.7 supports running arbitrary commands in a container post-backup. So the intention there is to use it to allow people to run stuff like any database backups they might need to do, or maybe do an FS freeze if they've got consistency issues or concerns. So that's kind of an escape valve in case there's something that we don't quite support that your use case needs.
And yeah, so just to clarify there, so we support running commands within pods that you have running in your cluster. So for example, if you're triggering a backup and immediately before backing up a database pod, you need to run an FS freeze so that you get a consistent backup. You can specify a pre-pod backup hook that says run the FS freeze, then back up the pod, including its associated volumes. And then, as Nolan said, we now support post hooks as well, so that obviously you can unfreeze the file system after backing up that pod and associated volume.
So in the same department of backup timeline, is the backup process itself atomic?
No, and that's something that's very difficult to do in general. So because we are using the Discovery API to get a list of all of the different API groups and resources that exist in Kubernetes, and we're not able to basically get a dump from etcd all at once, we do best effort. So yes, if you're in the middle of doing a flurry of additions, edits, deletions to your cluster while a backup is occurring, it's entirely possible that the backup will have some sort of inconsistent in the middle of processing things state. But our guidance there, or our thought process there, is that it's good enough, and to try and do an actual atomic backup would require a level of access that we don't have, and essentially kind of distributed two-phase commits, if you will, across etcd, and we'd have to coordinate snap freezing and snapshotting multiple persistent disks if you've got multiple PVs at play. So I think what we've got is pretty good, and it might not meet everybody's needs, but hopefully it'll get close.
But it's idempotent, right? So if I just ran it again, I would then get the non-in-between state of the cluster. I would get the existing state.
Yeah, you would get it at the time that you ran the backup. And so like I said, we hit discovery, and it'll tell us there's 10 different API groups, or however many there are. And within each API group, we'll see, okay, there's pods and services and secrets and whatever else. And so we issue a list request to each of the resource types. So we'll get all the pods that the server knows about now, and that is an atomic operation. But in between saying give me all the pods and give me all the secrets, stuff might have changed.
Got it. So it's a sequence of atomic operations.
Yes.
Yeah, that's like how COPS works with infrastructure too. That's super cool. Any other questions there? Okay. Next question. Can I back up my entire cluster? I think we've kind of have alluded to some of this a little bit, but this is, what does Ark back up and what doesn't it back up?
Yeah, so this question we've gotten a few times where people have asked in Slack, how do I back up my whole cluster? And the short answer is by default, you get everything. So if you don't specify specific namespaces or anything else, and you just say Ark backup create ABC, you will get a backup of everything in the cluster that Ark can find.
Okay. And you mentioned namespaces and labels, so you can separate out what Ark backs up based on arbitrary factors. Cool.
Yes. Steve or Nolan, you want to take this one?
Sorry, say that one more time.
What are the ways you can filter a backup?
Sure. So first of all, you can specify a label selector. So when you call Ark backup create, you can give it a label selector and it will filter on that. Second, we have the concept of included and excluded namespaces. So for example, if you just have a single namespace you want to back up, you can say include namespaces equals namespace foo. If you want to back up something like all namespaces except for a particular namespace, you can do that by using the excluded namespaces flag. So you'll get all namespaces except for a particular one. And then similarly to how we have included and excluded namespaces, we have included and excluded resources or resource types. So you can say, I want to back up everything except for events, or you can say, I want to back up deployments, services, and config maps. And so all of that is very easy to do on the command line. You also have the ability to turn on or off persistent volume snapshots. So if you have persistent volumes, but you don't actually want to take snapshots of them as part of the backup, you can very easily turn that off. And I think that covered everything, right? Did I miss any of the knobs?
I don't believe so.
And if I may, if you're just getting into Ark, I definitely recommend the first approach of not creating any filters or limits on the backup. Back up everything and then add granularity as you proceed.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of a really good point, which is that all of the filtering that you can do while you're backing up, you can also do while you're restoring. So you can easily just take a full cluster backup, and then when you go to restore, you can say, I only want to restore a particular namespace, or I only want to restore a particular type of resource. So yeah, that's a really good point.
Is there any concern of like the size of the backup, or does it ever get to a point where it's so big it takes forever, or like fill up the file system or anything?
So I mean, the backup size itself is going to be bounded essentially by the size limit of etcd, and so I don't remember off the top of my head what the limit is.
1.5 megabyte per object.
Yeah, it's 1.5 megs per object, but we don't actually store much in etcd anymore. So the log files that tell you what happened during a backup or during a restore go into object storage. The tarball that contains all of your Kubernetes resources also is placed into object storage, and the snapshots for any persistent volumes that you have are managed by the cloud providers that we integrate with. So we're not hitting any limits in etcd. Obviously, if you have a lot of data coming from Kubernetes, it will take longer to back it up than if you have a little, and it'll use more space. But it's generally, we're pulling the objects from Kubernetes and storing them as tar gzip compressed JSON files. So I imagine that there's a pretty good compression ratio there. So, it's as big as you've got data in Kubernetes as JSON.
Cool. Can I have backups run periodically?
Yes, we actually have a schedule command and data type that uses a lot of the, if I'm remembering right, it uses a lot of the cron specifiers. So you can tell Ark to execute this backup on a regular schedule using cron syntax.
Okay. Any questions on scheduling Ark? Rad. Is there an API I can use to create backups, schedules, and restores?
Yes. So all of these objects, all of these Ark types are implemented as custom resources within a Kubernetes cluster. And so you don't necessarily need to go through the Ark command line interface to create any of these. It's as simple as posting one of these resources to the Ark API server. And so the easiest way to see what these look like is, you can run an Ark backup get command and output it as YAML just within a -o YAML flag. And you can sort of see what the schema is for the type. And then if you like to, you can just submit that through the Kubernetes API.
Cool. This next question is exciting. It's a bit philosophical. If I already have Kubernetes resources in source control and I always deploy from there, why should I use Ark?
Okay, so I've been talking a lot about this one lately, and I do think that there is definitely utility and value in using Ark, even if you have that. And I would certainly recommend that you strive to having declarative infrastructure in source control. And if that's all you have and you don't have any persistent data, then Ark probably won't give you much value. But there are definitely places where it can. So first, if you have persistent volumes, like we've been talking about, you definitely can and should use Ark to back up, because you'll get snapshots of those PVs and they'll be associated with whatever you had deployed at that point in time. And then, of course, if some disaster strikes, you can restore from Ark and have new volumes created from those snapshots and associated or reassociated with the persistent volume claim or claims that you're using. And in theory, everything will look just like it did before whatever your disaster was. We probably need to do some thinking about what it looks like to go from I'll call it GitOps deployment, and then you have a disaster and you restore from Ark. What does it look like to go forward and to continue to maintain your deployments with GitOps, given that it's post an Ark restore? And I don't know that we have the solution 100% there, but so that's one use case, is backing up your persistent volumes and being able to restore. The second one is, okay, you don't have all of your infrastructure in source control, and you either want a way to do that, and so you could use Ark to download all of your data, and then we actually have an Ark backup download command where you can, after you've created a backup, you can pull down the tarball that we create, crack it open, and you have immediate access to all of the JSON that we backed up for you. So you could take that, massage it however you want, and put it into source control.
Okay. Could we get YAML out of the Ark backup?
It's JSON only right now.
Okay.
So that would be a potential feature request, certainly. One other use case is cloning clusters or portions of clusters. So let's say that you have a test cluster or a production cluster, and it's got some data in it, and you'd like to be able to take a backup and move it somewhere else. Ark is a good candidate for doing that. There are some limitations at the moment. So if you have clusters in Azure, for example, in different regions or locations, we don't really support restoring across locations for any of the cloud providers right now, and that's something that we definitely want to add support for. But if you're in the same region, then it should be fairly straightforward to take a backup and restore that backup into a different cluster. And it could be an empty cluster to start off with. And then one other thing that we want to do, which is related and we don't fully support it yet, is let's say that I have a namespace and it's got some stuff in it, including a persistent volume claim and related data. It would be pretty cool if I could take a backup of that and then kind of hand off a clone of that to you and say, here's a copy of my app with some data in it, and you can put it in your own namespace and fiddle around with it, and it won't affect my data and my app. But we're not quite there yet. We have one thing we've got to sort through before we can do that.
Okay. Awesome. And we've got 21 and a half minutes left on the call, and we have 4 questions left. Do you think about 15 minutes is going to be enough time to demo?
Yeah, I've got the cluster up and ready.
Okay, so let's maybe.
Kris, can I ask a question about the that last question?
Sure.
Yeah.
Hey Andy, has there been any thought or the topic brought up about being able to back up your cluster to Git? So
yes.
My idea is if we're using Git to deploy, all of our stuff is declarative and in Git, but it's coming from multiple repos. How do I know what is in that instance, what is in my cluster? I would think it'd be neat to have Ark be able to say, okay, just no volumes, just back up the state of my cluster into Git so that I can give configuration management person, here, this is the exact state, every version, all that.
So we have an issue, 280 or 238. I'm going to paste it in the chat here. Or Nolan beat me to it. Thanks, Nolan.
Yep.
And so I think that's a really good idea. And what we want to do to enable something like this is a little bit of refactoring of the code so that we can make both where you store, whether it's Git or S3 or Azure Blob or whatever, make that configurable. And we're kind of there with, like, you can have custom object store plugins, but we don't support Git at the moment. So it's kind of a munging of making that a little bit easier, but also having an abstraction around what we're actually backing up and like what that format is. So rather than saying Ark is hard-coded to store in a directory structure that ultimately turns into a tarball, I'd rather have an interface where I can just say, write this thing, and it happens to be a pod, and it's in this namespace, and whoever implements that interface could do it their own way. And so one could be our default going into a tarball, but another one just as easily could be this goes into a Git repo. And when you're done with the backup, it ends up doing a commit and a push as opposed to going into S3. So we have this issue that Nolan pasted the link to. I am soon going to resume trying to come up with this idea of backup targets, which I can talk about in a little bit, that'll incorporate trying to store in Git as well.
All right, thanks. Cool.
Awesome. Next question. What are the goals and target dates for cross-provider disaster recovery / migrations?
Great question. So we have a roadmap, which is linked in the office hours doc. And in that roadmap, we have backing up and restoring across multiple regions and zones around June if we're lucky.
June 14th is the date we put, but that's fungible.
Yeah, so that's for like within a cloud provider, but going across regions or across zones. I really think that if we're going to do cross cloud provider, we first need what Steve was talking about earlier when he was talking about Restic and being able to snapshot and restore non-cloud volumes, or really any volume. Because alternatively, let's say that you have you start off in GKE and you've got a persistent disk, and we snapshot it. If you want to restore that back up to Azure or AWS or anywhere else, you basically need a virtual machine in GCE where you can attach a volume from that snapshot so that you can get at the data. You then need to take all the data and move it to your destination. And so that could involve a lot of orchestration that could get complex fairly quickly. I think it might be easier to say we're going to do something like a RESTIC style backup where the files ultimately end up in object storage, and then it would be easier for Ark to orchestrate just taking those files out of Ark, out of object storage and sticking them into another cloud provider's disk. But we're not sold on the design yet, or it's not solidified. But I would expect sometime this summer to fall would be when we would hopefully be able to do across providers easily.
Okay. Very excited. What is the difference between a hook and a plugin?
Steve, you want to take it?
Yeah, I can take that. So these are both mechanisms for extending or customizing the behavior of a backup or a restore. But so a hook is basically a command that Ark will execute within a pod that you have running in the cluster as part of the backup. So going back to the database example that we had, you could have a pre-backup hook that says, I need to run fsfreeze on my volume before I back up this pod and its associated volume. And then immediately after backup, I need to unfreeze it. So the hook basically lets you run a command within your pod. Plugins are a little bit different. So we have a number of different types of plugins. So the first two are the object store and the block store. And these are basically ways for you to extend Ark to be able to use your own type of object storage or your own type of block storage for doing snapshots. The other two types of plugins we have are per item backup actions and restore actions. And so these operate as each individual item is being backed up or restored, but they let you essentially plug in a bit of Go code that could do anything from actually modifying the item being backed up. So for example, you could add an annotation to every object that's being backed up. You could call out to an external system. So if you want to do, it's not exactly a webhook, but if you wanted to do something sort of similar to a webhook where you called out to some third-party API while a particular item was being backed up, you could do that within a plugin. And then similarly with restores. So again, you could apply labels or annotations on each item as it's being restored. So again, hooks are basically commands within pods during backups or restores. And plugins, at least the per item backup and restore plugins, are bits of code that can permute the items being backed up or call out to third-party systems.
Thank you. That was awesome. I think we're into our 15 minutes of demo time, so we can save this last question for the next conference call. And I'm going to hand it off to Andy for a demo. And then my one ask would be if I could get a precious 30 seconds at the end of the call to ask folks if we want to keep doing these or not.
Definitely.
Cool.
Can you all see my terminal and read it?
Yes and yes.
Yep.
At least I can.
Excellent. Okay, so what I have is, get this clear. So I have K alias to kube control because I'm lazy. So I have one node up here running in GKE. I have pre-installed Ark, and you'll see we have two namespaces. So one of the things that we added to our latest release, version 0.7, which came out last week, was the ability to delete backups. And it took us a while to figure out how we wanted to approach that. We may change the implementation a little bit, but what we realized when we did it was if you ran our clean up and tear down instructions from our README after going through the demo that I'm going to show you, you would end up with the Heptio Ark namespace stuck terminating, which nobody likes. So we ended up splitting the Ark server control plane into a separate namespace to try and alleviate that issue. So that's why you see two of them here at this time. And if we look inside of Heptio Ark, there's no, actually I have one backup that I did before, and you can also do this with Ark backup get. And I'm gonna go ahead and do a new one to show you what we've got. I do have this here. So I'm gonna deploy an Nginx example. So we have a namespace called Nginx, a persistent volume claim, also called Nginx, and I'm asking for 50 megs of storage. I have an Nginx deployment that makes use of my persistent volume claim, and it's going to put anything in that persistent volume under varlog Nginx. And then I have a service for Nginx as well, although I'm not going to be making use of it for this demo. So first thing I'm going to do is just make sure that we don't have an Nginx namespace, and it's not there. So I will go ahead and apply my Nginx file that we were just looking at. And this creates the 4 items in there. And if we look at the persistent volumes, you'll see that I have this new one that's bound to my Nginx claim. And if we look in here, we do have a pod that is container creating. Oh, now it's running. So what I'm going to do is kind of split screen here, and I'm up in the top right. And what I'm going to do is port forward into the Nginx pod here so that I can access it locally. And I'm going to go ahead and just curl my local port 8000, and you'll see I get some HTML back, and the port forward says I handled the connection. So I'm just going to run this, oops. I'm going to run this curl a few more times just to get some entries in the log file. And now we can actually exec into here. And assuming my terminal's not working, or working, you can look at the access log. Oops. There we go. All right, so you'll see that there's a handful of entries in my access log in that pod. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and create a backup. So this is just Ark backup create, and then I give it a name. So I already had one, so we'll call this Nginx 2. And I really only care about this one namespace, which is Nginx. So this tells me that it submitted the backup request, and you can describe it to get some more information about it. So let's do that. And this spits out a whole bunch of information, but the important things here is that the phase is completed down here in the middle. And you'll also see some information about the persistent volume or volumes that we snapshotted as part of the backup process. So now that we have that, I'm going to go ahead and simulate a disaster here. So we will delete everything that I just created. And this will take a little while for the, make sure this works. What I want to do here is just wait until this persistent volume gets deleted, because it takes a little while for the cloud controller that is in GKE that's responsible for getting rid of this to actually delete it. So before I can do my restore, we need the PV to go away. And this should take no more than a minute or two. While we're waiting, does anybody have any questions about what I've done so far? No, cool. Maybe while we're waiting, we'll take a look at the backup tarball. So one thing I can do is Ark backup download Nginx 2, and this will tell me that it downloaded the file. And if I tar tf it, you'll see this is exactly what we backed up. So I have the replica set for Nginx, the deployment, the PVC, or the PV, the PVC, the namespace, some secret, or the default token secret, endpoints, services, and so on. So we backed up everything that was in the Nginx namespace, as well as the persistent volume, which these are cluster scoped resources. So if Ark were only limiting to just what was in the Nginx namespace, we would not be pulling down this persistent volume. But we have some logic in there that says, let's go look at all of the pods that are selected for backup, and if any of them have persistent volume claims, let's make sure that we back those PVCs up. And then for any PVC that we're backing up, let's go make sure we back up the PVs associated with it. So that's why we ended up with that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Why are we using JSON there?
It was just what we ended up doing. So we certainly could do it as YAML or some other format, but for right now, JSON's just the approach that we took.
Okay, so there's no technical reason,
no.
JSON. Okay, that was my question.
Nope.
So Andy, another quick question, if I may.
Yeah.
You have cluster scoped PV, but we aren't grabbing any roles or role bindings. So is it possible that if you isolate the backup just to a specific namespace that you would not be able to restore if you do not also have the cluster scoped roles?
Yeah, so that is a known gap that we definitely want to address. And I don't know if we have to be, I don't know if we have to be just very thorough and grab all the RBAC resources and try and weed out the ones that we don't need just by looking at service accounts and whatnot for the namespaces that are included in the backup, or if there's some way to try and be a little bit more optimized about it. But we do recognize that that's a limitation, and it may not be listed on the roadmap. It may not even be a GitHub issue yet, but we know we need to do it. Okay, so we have no PVs, which means Google got rid of it for me. So, and just to show you, there is no Nginx namespace sitting around at this time. So we can go ahead and do a restore create. And I'm going to use my Nginx 2 here. And so just like creating a backup, it tells us that it submitted the request successfully, and we can describe it for more details. So I'm going to do that. And here you'll see it's still in progress. So we are going to need to wait for that to finish. And now it's done. And let me rerun this up at the top so it's a little bit easier to see. So we see the name of the restore, the backup it's associated with, the status is completed, and there's a warning. So let's go see what's in this warning. And here, towards the bottom, we have one warning that says in the Nginx namespace, there was already the default service account. And what this means is Ark tried to create a service account called default and got a conflict, or it already exists when it tried to create it. And at this point in time, we throw our hands up in the air and say, oh, well, it was already there, so we're just going to leave it alone. And we have a couple issues that are open about this for trying to do custom conflict resolution when we do get a conflict or there's an already exists. But that's something Nolan's going to be working on. So he can post a link to that issue or the issues, and we will try and get that in a future version.
So that would just give us the ability to say if a resource already exists, we would like to clobber it, delete the old one.
Either clobber or do some selective merging.
Okay.
Yeah. So for the service count example, one thing that came up was wanting to maintain image pull secrets across restores. So yeah.
So I know we only have a couple minutes left. I'm just going to run through the stuff here. So you'll see the Nginx namespace is back. We have a pod back and running. We have a PV. And if I get this working right.
I'm so excited right now.
Yeah, we'll hope this works. And there we go. Those are the log lines that we had from the PV snapshot. We do recommend that you FS freeze before and after taking a snapshot if you can. I know when we were doing our Rook example at KubeCon, we definitely had to have FS freeze in there. Otherwise, it didn't snapshot anything. This example doesn't use it because GKE is nice to us. But yeah, I would definitely recommend that you do that if you can. And that, I think, is about the end of the demo.
Just out of curiosity, when you do, if you don't specify a specific namespace and you just back up all of your cluster, does it also back up the Ark servers? The Ark.
It does, but like you would get a conflict when you try to restore it, assuming it was already there. So, you know, the Ark deployment would just stay as is. Any secrets for your cloud credentials would stay as is.
Okay.
Okay, Kris, back to you.
Cool. We had one quick question from somebody in the chat, which was, can I deploy Ark in ARM7, ARMv7?
We don't currently produce any Docker images other than for Linux AMD 64, but we could presumably build them. And so if there's a need, we can look into getting the makefile updated and the build scripts updated so that we can do multi-arch support. And fortunately, GCR now supports fat manifests, so we can upload you know, what looks to be a single image and have it support multiple architectures. So if there's demand, we can certainly look into it.
So they could just open up an issue and then it would just get tracked like all the other feature requests?
Yes, that would be the best way to do it.
Cool. And then the last little bit here is if we could just do a quick show of hands if we would like to keep doing these calls or if we want to do them ad hoc. Does anybody have any ideas or opinions on the frequency of these moving forward, if at all?
I enjoy them.
I think for our next one, maybe doing more of a open design session and just Q&A. But I'm thinking maybe next month, we could do it monthly. Do we want to do it bi-weekly?
I was thinking quarterly, but...
Okay.
Yeah, I would be fine with monthly. I mean, I potentially would be fine with every other week, but you know, we kind of have to see if we get continued participation and if there's you know, sufficient interest.
Okay, so then maybe let's just plan, we'll push one back like 30 plus days. We'll kind of take that one ad hoc, and if it's as beneficial as this one, we'll schedule it. I'll ask the same question again and we'll go from there.
So I found this from a retweet from somebody on Twitter. Is that the best way to find these?
For right now, the Heptio Twitter account, I'm working on having like a community like resource page on our website that'll have all of the open source conference call information on it, but that's not out yet.
Okay, I'll just stay tuned.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we have, we're in Ark DR in the Kubernetes Slack. We have a Google group. We're on Twitter. So there's lots of ways to come find us.
Yeah, and of course, I'm here to help you guys. So if there's ever anything I can do or people I can connect you with, let me know.
Great. Well, thanks for the demo. That was really nice watching you do that, Andy, and thanks, Kris, for you know, tying it all together, bringing us here and having fun.
Awesome. Thanks for showing
You're
up.
welcome. Thank you for participating.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.